So I'd rather thought that after hearing the morning's presentations, I would have a pretty good idea of where to fill in the gaps and how to intermediate between them. But I don't have such a clear idea, so I'm just going to launch forward on my perspective. Now, when I say my perspective, I'm an economist by instinct and a mathematical economist or game theorist at that. So at a certain point, I might shade over into or invoke some ideas, certainly from game theory, maybe a bit from epistemic logic, and some from complexity. And I'm happy to develop those formally if we want. But I have a little précis of what I'm going to try to cover. The first thing is that we do get bent out of shape about privacy, and certainly it's regarded by many as a fundamental human right. But in our existence, you know, the place from where our thinking and our understanding and our laws and so on come from, it's a relatively recent invention. Recent in the sense of, 100 or 200 years, probably not much more than that. So as fundamental rights go, shortly after access to the internet, it's probably one of the younger ones, and therefore we should expect to see, or we're entitled to think of it not as a thing in itself, but as a social mechanism, and that's largely the perspective that I'm going to take. And in particular, because it has the word right in it, I'm going to use the word right the way an economist uses right. It's something which enables markets and other forms of interactive governance to function. Now, we have a bunch of assumptions about privacy, and there are certainly people who would tend to regard the challenges to those assumptions coming from new technologies, and I will say a bit about how internet innovation challenges privacy. There's one sense in which it does, because the ways we thought we were private before are now being challenged by technology. So Google Street View, or the Amazon thing that flies over your house and looks down through your skylights, or other things one could do by bouncing laser beams off windows or listening to the electromagnetic things from your keys are examples of this. Things that you did that were private because they took place in private space, where you had an expectation that you would not be overheard, and you could therefore conduct different kinds of communication and action than you would do in a public space. In a public space, you're aware of the message you're sending. It's like when I was around in Santa Monica, we had secret and then top secret areas. What was important about those areas was that if you were in it, everyone in it was cleared to the same level, and you could have certain kinds of conversations. It's not that they were good conversations, it's just that you didn't have to worry about whether they might be misconstrued in a particular way. So the question about what things are private is a vital question, and one of the points I'm going to argue, in contradistinction, I guess, to what we've heard thus far, is that increasingly data privacy is possibly the least important notion of privacy. My records are not me, and in particular, in a world in which I have multiple and diffused identities controlled by many, many people, they are very much not me. And because I'm going to live a long time, I hope, and will become mentally incompetent, and will have to delegate my identity to other people, they're not even tied to me biologically, me. So there are things that go beyond records that may be more important. And two of the things that I'm particularly aware of is, the first is, as an economist, I believe that people make choices that are in some perception of their own interests. Now, it's not quite the same as rationality. It does allow for cognitive framing. I won't choose things that I'm not aware of, and I'll only pay attention to the consequences of my choices to which my attention has been drawn. But nonetheless, I'm sort of trying to do that. Now, if I go on a website without any personally identifiable information, and I respond to certain things that are there, and based on that response, I'm offered other things to respond to, I may well wind up very rapidly in making choices that I would not have wanted to have made and may regret if push comes to shove. Now, this isn't new. When you go to buy a used car, you get the same thing. The car salesman susses you out and says, oh, look, the upholstery matches your wife's eyes, or whatever it is. Don't pay attention to the rattle in the engine. So nobody's expecting that this model of rational choice based on perfect information is universal or a good description of reality. It obviously is departed from. The question is whether I am or should be aware of the ways in which I'm being manipulated. And that manipulation of my choice is an intrusion into my private space. And the reason that matters is that acting from private space is acting for which I can be held accountable. Whereas, I mean, Kant said this. He said that your liberty lies in acting in response to moral duty. Why? Because moral duty is something you imposed on yourself. Everything else is the world nudging you around. You can pretend that you're making choices, but it is only a pretense. And if we look to people's fixed and immutable preferences, the things that profiling should bring up, as a guide to what people are going to do, then you'll find that that's a poor guide, because you can change people's preferences quite easily. Now, if you immunize them from that process of change, then you can hold them responsible. There's also the sense of privacy which is kind of internal. Whether or not the speed cameras and are actually running face recognition software, and whether or not the little things on the light posts in London are listening to my voice to see whether I'm getting angry so they can dispatch armed officers to calm me down if I have an angry moment, doesn't really matter. What matters is, do I think that they're looking and watching? Because that, too, is an infringement on some kind of personal space. And since most of our structures, at least in economics, are based on people acting in a coherent way that they can control, things that upset that are things with which we are concerned. There's also the question about whether these data are me. The data that are held in government databases consist of records about me. Those records may have mistakes, and the more reliable, the more mashed together or linked up those data are, the more intensively they're used by e-government services or insurance companies or whatever, the more they become my identity, or at least they define the choices available to me in the world. But the data are reasonably unique, unless you do, like I suppose many of us do, and randomize the responses you give to questions asked on forms that have no obvious connection to what it is you're asking for. I mean, there have been some really interesting papers on this recently, that you can run experiments and get people to tell you the most amazingly intimate and personal things for no particular reason, except that you think you are responding to an official whose goodwill rather than rational use of information is the thing you have to court, right? You want to be on their good side, so you tell them stuff. And certain genders, certain ethnicities tell more stuff than others, and digital natives and digital migrants tell different degrees of stuff. It may also be that you're applying for something and you don't understand the criteria according to which you're going to be judged. It could be applying for a university or a credit card or a mortgage. You want them to think that you are the kind of person to whom they should extend this, whatever that means. Not knowing what it means, you give them lots of things. And those things that you give them may be valuable. And that's where I think the central tension lies. That we have, on the one hand, the construction of privacy is an essential human right that is inalienable, non-transferable. You can't break it down and sell off little bits of it. And on the other hand, the data that are, at least in European law and American law, more or less coextensive with your privacy right, are valuable, economically valuable. And therefore, it was our contention in the report to which Ian refers, that if you have half the world which thinks of it as a human right and half the world which thinks of it as an economic right, you wind up with a tussle, like safe harbor, in which neither is the human right protected, nor is the economic value of those data optimized, let alone flowing back to the person about whom those data refer. So in that sense, the tension between the value of the data and the existence value, the use value and the existence value of the data may be very important. Now, it's particularly true because the nature of the value is not the same as the nature of the value for, let's say, physical commodities. If I have a laptop and Chris steals my laptop, then he's got it and I don't. Now, data about me as a person can create and capture value in various ways. It can allow you to target me with adverts that sell me things that I will buy but will not benefit from, right? That's a transfer of value from me to you. It can allow you to target me with offers from which I will benefit, which is mutual creation of value. It may be that you use these data to feed into, so I bought a car, Now, me being me, I'm unlikely to buy a car again for some very large number of years, during which time the world will be a different place. So the use of the data about my car purchase have no impact on my welfare whatsoever, but they may be very beneficial to you. So all the possible combinations of whether these data are valuable or harmful to me, or valuable or harmful to you, exist in the world. And so I think that a regime of rights that doesn't recognize this is no better than a regime of rights about secure or proprietary data in financial trading situations. In financial trading situations, there's some information which is valuable only if nobody else knows it, right? There's going to be a merger. And if I know about it before anyone else does, then I can buy low and sell high. There's other kinds of information which is only valuable if everybody knows it. And to have a set of presumptions that assume that the value is divided up one way is probably a recipe for disaster. Now, another thing is that privacy is related to other concepts that are generally viewed as being things like privacy, but for corporations. So, for example, security and integrity might be like that. But it's not really. When I am at home and my blinds are drawn, I know that only God and my family can see what I'm doing. Even I can't, which is probably just as well. On the other hand, it may be that if I release information and it's observed about me, I may wonder about what the consequence to me of that information being observed is. In other words, even if I don't know how you can benefit from this information or how I might suffer from it, so for example, my political utterance, which was anonymized and is now tagged to me, now that exposes me to a risk. Now, depending on my experience of oppressive regimes or what have you, or running for office, I may feel that that's a big vulnerability, or I may not. It has nothing to do with the facts of the case. It's a sense of insecurity that comes from living in either public space or private space. And so there are connections there, because the privacy right doesn't exist independently, in other words, of these economic forces and rules about security, crime prevention, and so on. Another part of what I'm going to try to argue is that it's very simple to give easy answers to hard questions. And things like privacy, trust, and security are regarded as good things in the sense that if you don't have enough of them, a little bit more would be better. But as we've already heard from Joss this morning, more trust is not necessarily a good thing. More privacy is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, a homeless person on the street, although they're in public view, has got an enormous amount of privacy, and it does them no good. The hospital patient in the bed who can't have a chart at the foot of their bed because it would expose their personal information to passers-by, like nurses and doctors, has a degree of privacy that does them no good. So there are some kinds of privacy that can be a prison rather than a refuge, and we sort of need to pay some attention to that. Same with trust. If I trust you, that may allow for certain economies. I don't have to monitor what you do. I can delegate certain things to you, and we can proceed more efficiently. But if I trust you too much, or if my trust leads you into being untrustworthy and taking advantage, that was clearly not a good thing. And so the monotonicity is probably something we might want to avoid. Similarly, things like privacy is dead. It's easy to give answers like that and say, get over it, it's a mechanism that we don't need. On the other hand, it does have certain usefulness. If I feel responsible for what I do in private, or if a grant of access to my private data is a currency with which I indicate my goodwill and I'm buying trust in that way, depriving me of the ability to use that currency is probably not necessarily a good thing. Similarly, for identities, this is an old argument about e-identity and whether we should only have one identity, whether it should be federated. The point about identity, there's a very nice article by Ariel Rubinstein and I'm not sure who the other author was, Yair Talman, I believe, called On the Question, Who is a J? And it was about identity, being a member of a group called J. And there were at least 3 senses in which you could be a J. Members of that group, in other words, other Js, might assert that you are one of them. You might self-identify as a member of that group, or some third party having nothing to do with either the members or you would assert that you were one of them. Now, all of those create data which is about you and which can impinge on your personal space, can delimit your ability to act and to derive benefit, and therefore to invest in your identity as a kind of asset. But because it is jointly produced by all of these different parties, a simple rule which says that my identity should be a single thing with everything put together in it. Well, if we had that, and if it was complete, we wouldn't have things like insurance, for example. We probably wouldn't have things like reputations, because reputations are there to provide a link between my past behavior and how I'll behave towards you in the future if we have some kind of transaction. So if we didn't have those imperfections, we wouldn't need those mechanisms. But the mechanisms themselves are an incentive for us to behave in a reasonable fashion. Shakespeare, I guess, because we're sort of, he's in between where I live and where I am right now. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Twas mine, 'tis his, 'twill be slave to thousands. But who steals from me my good name takes that which not enriches him, but makes me poor indeed. So there is this notion that reputation, in other words, this token for this information, the public face of my private being, is useful because it gives me access to other people and encourages me to behave in a reasonable way. Now, if I took something like a credit rating, and the credit rating is not private information, but it's certainly based on private information, and we act solely on the basis of that, in a certain sense, you could say that a credit rating should be an incentive device. If I mess up and I don't pay my bills, or something goes wrong and I'm careless in my financial life, my credit rating will suffer, and I will have an incentive to then mend my ways. If there's a mistake floating around about me, I will have an incentive to correct that mistake. But if everybody uses that credit rating, when I get a bad name, then opportunities cease to come, and I no longer have an incentive to mend my ways, because there's no benefit in it for me. And so what was an incentive has simply become a self-fulfilling label. And we should be careful when we create privacy-enhancing or reputation-enhancing mechanisms to take account of that. Then finally, there's a point about big data. And part of the thing there is this, I mean, the internet world is a world in which lots of things could be collected. Now, those are only data. They're not information. They need to be interpreted and contextualized and all that. But there is this notion that if you collect everything, then we can design rules to make sure that that everything is used in an appropriate fashion. And big data analytics is an example of this. From my own perspective, I'm very concerned that the availability of those data will drive out thought, that we can use quantitative, algorithmic, mathematical analysis, and it will give us numbers, and numbers have a lack of ambiguity about them. So we've just come through our exam boards at Warwick, and we've classified all the students based on their performance. Now, I know that if they don't get a 2-1 or above, they're on the trash heap. They've thrown away 3 years of their life. They've thrown away a large amount of money, soon to become an eye-watering amount of money. And I know that our only real basis for doing this, increasingly, is numerical data about how they have performed on their exams. Now, if those data are wrong, or if there are bits of context, like they were trapped by a volcano and couldn't get back for a final exam, that happened last year, are not in those data, then we will make the wrong decision, and they will not recover from it. So, at any rate, those are some of the elements. Now, it's about markets, and I should say something about markets. I'll say something about how I think of privacy in a moment. A market is a mechanism. It's a governance mechanism. One of the things that markets do is that they take people who have different preferences and they put them into contact with each other, and then they make trades. And the result of those trades is that they come to share a single common preference about one good versus another good. So if there's something that you have that affects me, and we are in contact through the market, I can express to you my preferences, and you can express to me your preferences about this thing, and we can reconcile those preferences. If there's information that I have and you don't have, in a market, it will be in my interest to reveal that information through my activity in an ideal market. And so what the market will do is it will collect up information from people, it will combine that information, and it will price the associated risk. So that's what markets are supposed to do. They're supposed to move from our individual settings to our collective behavior. Now, because markets can protect privacy or erode it, I mean, if, for example, we are in an auction, and in an auction, if we're auctioning off something about which we are all differently informed, and where the value of what Chris or Ian observes is relevant to my own valuation of it. So sometimes when we auction things, they have only a private value, like, oh, I don't know, a meal that I'm about to eat, right? Because once I've eaten it, it's gone. So all I care about is it going to taste good or not? And that's, to some degree, a purely subjective thing. So I still care about whether Ian and Chris value that high or low, because I need to decide whether I want to outbid them, and if so, what's the smallest amount I can bid and take it off them. So I do have to pay some attention to them. But it's different than if their information tells me something about what the value to me is. So in that sense, when we have an auction, if I know something about Chris and I know something about Ian, and I see that there is a bid there of £27.50, it will be different for me if I know that the bid came from Chris or the bid came from Ian. And so in financial transactions, you sometimes find markets where the order books are open. So all the trades are visible, and who made the trades is visible. There are other ones in which the order books are closed, and all you see is the net amount bid, the net amount asked, and the number of shares that have traded hands. And then there are markets in which it is optional as to whether you reveal your identity or not. Markets perform very differently in those circumstances. It's sort of technical to explain why. But the point is that market operation can therefore protect privacy, or it can erode privacy. It can beak into my personal information. And because of that, in addition to having markets that affect the privacy that I enjoy or the use that I make of it, we can get derivative markets in privacy. So if I'm using cloud computing and I am a person or a small business, one of the things that I may do in the cloud is that I may ask for certain processing to be done. That will create information that's relevant to me, namely the cloud operator's operational logs that say what operations I asked to have done. Now, it's not my information. I didn't create it. It's proper management information for the cloud operator, but it does convey information about me. Now, the person who provides the application that's running on the cloud platform, who is the one who, in a sense, creates that information, may not be a person with whom I have a direct contractual relationship. So I can't immediately control this. But what I can do is I can say, I'm concerned about the management of these data. And if I do, some bright spark will come along and say, well, here's a privacy protection scheme. I will sell you the benefits of this. And so you can get markets not only in personal data, but markets in protections for those personal data. And many of us, I guess, have logged on to our e-banking sites and seen these little offers that say for a certain amount of money, we'll sell you identity theft protection, which is, I thought, offered by a third party, not by the bank itself, which is a very interesting ways. But the point is that markets themselves will respond to unmet needs for privacy protection. Okay, now I've said everything about that. Oh, well, a couple of other things that came out in relation to what Joss was saying earlier. I've already talked about how value is created and captured. But identification of me as an individual may be entirely inessential to that. In other words, if you can, when I talk to my insurance company, there is some asymmetry of information there. Normally, when we make models of insurance markets, we say the insurance company knows less about the person than they do, and we design a mechanism that will elicit that information from the person, that gets people to reveal what their accident probabilities are and so on and so forth. And just as Joss was saying in relation to privacy, in relation to the revelation of information, there is always a price to be paid. If you look at these mechanisms, they are always costly. They very rarely balance the budget. On the other hand, it rather assumes that I know more than the insurance company. Actually, in fact, if I try to buy driver's insurance or something like that, the insurance company knows more about me than I do about myself. Not me in particular, but about those characteristics that are correlated with my accident probability. So in that particular case, being profiled down to the point of people like me is sufficient to expose everything of value about my personal information. So if there was a privacy interest there, it's violated without the need for identification. So triangulating people may be useful. And then,
is this?
Yeah.
This is quite common in privacy invasive products, right?
Yeah.
That actually, for the first time, the company to whom you're talking knows more about you than you know about yourself.
Yes.
In terms of your propensity for that product.
Yes, more than you know cognitively and more than you can command economically, right? The stuff on your loyalty card from Tesco's, all that sort of clickstream information of what you bought, they're the ones who have hold of it. They have the analytics to understand it. You've probably got only the dimmest recollection of what you've bought over time, so they understand your patterns better than you do.
And does that suggest that if they've engaged in automated decision-making based on having more information than you do,
Yep.
then you have a kind of doubling of a problem caused by the automation of that personalized information?
It
in
may,
other words,
yeah.
normally you have a normative understanding of how you're going to use your own information,
Yep.
and you're making the decision. In this situation, they're going to make the decision, and they have no normative understanding at all. They're simply processing information they already have.
And you may not be in a position to know that they have done that, or to query it, or to call it back. But if you then think about the competitive landscape in which people are competing to take good customers and to pass on bad customers, where it's not simply the automated decision-making of a single motivated entity that you could understand, but of a complex network of people interacting for you, then it becomes a real problem, because it's not simply my interest versus yours. It is whether we have a system that works at all.
Right. So in the case of, say, 17 to 21-year-old men wanting motor insurance who live in cities, the industry basically churns the numbers and says, right, we will not offer any insurance to anybody in this particular category, which results actually, not necessarily unexpectedly, but the machine wouldn't recognize. The result is you get 1 million people driving without insurance, because there is no insurance product that's acceptable to them.
And
at which point there is a need to intervene in the market that's failing like that.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely, you would think so. The disclosure of certain kinds of information, or the granting access under certain conditions, would be a legal requirement, simply because we need the operation of it. It's like the public option in health insurance. Right. There are people who, under conditions of good information, will not get insurance. They will be enormously socially costly if they don't. So therefore, it's necessary to take steps that they do, and that will infringe their privacy, but they'll be alive.
So do governments, sorry, I'm jumping ahead slightly, but so do governments understand this policy outcome, that as we're getting greater information awareness, we are finding areas that government never previously intervened in, where they do need to intervene in order to prevent the kind of problems caused by companies understanding the information so much better?
Well, mandatory disclosure is certainly becoming more common in certain areas. Try selling a house.
Right.
You'll have to disclose a lot more than you ever did before. But I mean, the same thing's true with mashing together databases, benefits databases, just putting together the two databases inside DVLA, right? So driver's licensing and owning a car are now cross-linked. They used not to be, and there were great consequences for that, like unlicensed drivers who had perfectly good insurance. Yeah.
Let's take an example of a recommendation system.
Yeah.
For example, Amazon.com guides me to the music and books people like me has chosen.
Yep.
The thing is that the statistics behind the algorithm, so statistics in general, is about average.
Yep.
Not unique point in the distribution.
Yes.
So I just followed the items chosen by the people like me, and that would lead to the consequences that the distribution of entire population, the diversity of the entire population of customers decrease.
Yeah, there's a nice paper by Galeotti and Goyle in AER from 2010 called The Law of the Few, about you can either gather information or you can get it from other places. And almost inevitably, a very few sources will come to cover that. Now, with things like recommendation systems...
So it's Andrea Gagliotti in the American Economic Group.
Yes, right, and Sanjeev Goyal.
James Evans.
Sorry?
James Evans in science.
Yeah, yeah.
He's about the citations.
Yeah.
PhD students use the smaller number of citations.
Yeah.
Because of JSTOR and
Yeah, and in fact, well, okay, no, sorry, that's a digression. I want, because that's not really directly about privacy, but in one sense, the recommendation systems also, because it's not simply diagnosing your preferences and meeting them, because these are social goods that you're consuming. You will discuss them with your friends, and therefore you create communities of interest around a particular piece of content, and seeding those communities of interest is of economic value to the people who distribute that content. So just like payola used to work in the old days of AM radio, you can create identities and invite people into those identities to take them on, and then the consequence is not that you don't get offered things that you're interested in, but it becomes increasingly hard for Blackwell's, let's say, or Heffer's or some other bookshop to take you away because they don't have that information. So you get a little bit, but then you get locked in and the market stops working. Yeah. Okay. And behavioral marketing is becoming more important, so privacy of action works. Okay, so what do I mean by privacy? So there are some words that I'd like to say a few things about. Whoops. Okay, so the first thing is what do we mean when we talk about privacy? And so I've talked about data privacy, privacy of action I've talked about. There are relational forms of privacy, which may be not anonymized communication, but just the mutual privacy of a communication. If I'm talking to someone, that information is jointly private to the two of us. It's not mine, it's not theirs. I'm just going through a negotiation with Nesta about that, about some interviews that we conducted, to which they would like to have access. And yeah, we conducted the interviews, but the interview subjects need to have a word in this. So it's private, but not ours, and not wholly theirs. Spatial privacy, which is where you are when you're in public space and so on. Corporeal privacy, whether your body can be invaded. Well, the Americans know all about this. American women certainly know all about this. But I suppose people who use biometric identification systems may have feelings about this as well. Iris is a particularly interesting example. It will identify you, but what it identifies is your body. And it's nice, it's better than fingerprint, because it can't be stolen. Fingerprints can easily be stolen. And even if you know they're stolen, there's nothing you can do about it, because there's not much information in a fingerprint. There's a lot of information in an iris, and so you get arbitrarily high accuracy of identification with a random sample of the iris from the field of the iris. And if it's stolen, you just generate another random sample. They've got the full picture, you've got your eye, and only the attacker is left with this worthless scrap of ephemera.
Well, the attacker could take a very high-res picture of your retina.
But they need to know what sample was being taken, right? So having compromised the previous sample, we would have regenerated the key.
But your iris remains the same, whatever algorithm is applied to this sample taken.
Yeah, but what the act of identification comes from the Hamming distance of precisely those bits of the sample that are presented. And if he presents the wrong set of bits,
no, but if the attacker has the entire corpus
and knows which sample is being used, right? That has to be agreed between the identified person and the database system. If they know how the new one was generated, then they can follow you and steal your identity. But it's harder than if they have everything and you're presenting everything.
Harder, yes.
Yeah, harder, not impossible. John Dogman is a strong recommender of those.
Of course, because he owns the patents.
Oh, no, they've lapsed now. They've lapsed. It's okay. Yeah. And then there's this one about the right to be let alone, this feeling that you're not being surveilled, or just the notion that there's no reason why you should be interfered with. You should be able to enjoy yourself in privacy if you want, but that gets philosophical. So Louis Brandeis was the one who talked about the right to be let alone. John Perry Barlow, who's already been evoked in this room, said relying on the government to protect your privacy is like asking a peeping Tom to install your window blinds. And so there is a question about how you trade off different interests in people's privacy, whether it's privacy or security. I'm going to the United States later this week, and I don't expect to have any reasonable expectation of privacy as I go in. Now, another thing about privacy is that if you know something about me that may or may not constrain my privacy, or it may or may not damage my interests, if you know the information but don't use it, and I don't know that you know the information, then in some real sense, there is no harm done to me. Now, there may be potential harm if you're just parking the information. Apparently in Stalinist Russia, if they thought you'd been straying from the straight and narrow, you'd be summoned in to see your boss. And your boss would, as soon as you entered the room, excuse himself and go out of the room and leave you for 5 minutes. And on the desk would be your file with all the stuff that was known about you. And he would come back after 5 minutes and say, okay, you can go. And that was the end of it, right? That was the discipline device. Because it wasn't what was known. It was that they wanted you to know that they knew those things. And that sent a very powerful message that couldn't have been sent probably in any other way. So that regress about what you know about me, what I know that you know about me, what you know that I know that you know about me, and so on, is very important, particularly if you're going to interpret or constrain my actions. So in that sense, privacy is itself a network. It's a set of connections between states of knowledge. And some of the formal analysis the game theorists do around privacy is based on that. Now, there are other things which are private precisely because they're not protected and don't draw attention to themselves. And those are the things that are hidden in plain sight. There are quite a lot of things where we might have an interest in not having people know about them, but at least for some long period of time, you could rely on people's laziness or inattention or lack of resource. I drive every week between Warwick and Cambridge, and there are a lot of Gatsos and other forms of camera along the road. And I and everybody else who drives on that road has a pretty good idea, learned from watching other people, of which of those cameras are likely to be monitored at all. So you are in public sight, but no one's paying attention, and that's fine. It's just the way you like it. As long as you act within certain boundaries, you won't be caught. Okay. Now, when we have privacy, we have a notion of protected space, the thing which is ours. And we can worry about whether it is a single individual, whether it's an individual at a certain point in time or only in certain contexts. All these kinds of things we may need to worry about if, as I contend, the technology and our evolving attitudes towards privacy have made us consider whether we should shore up the existing system or modify it in some way. And it's useful to distinguish between a privacy right and a privacy interest. That's a sort of easy way of saying that an interest is something that you can trade. It's an asset. You can rebundle it, you can repackage it. I can sell you my data. And there now exist intermediaries who will claw back your data from the internet and help you to repackage it and resell access to it. But when they do that, there are different ways in which those data can be used, and you can brand the package in different ways. One way is to target me and meet my needs and gain privileged access to my bank account. Another way is to understand the behavior of people like me as a data point. Now, one of the interesting questions is if you use data and data analytics as a way of understanding populations and how they respond, then you have to worry about the representativeness of the sample. How much does it matter? And if you think about basing a marketing campaign on people who participate in focus groups, if people participate in focus groups either to manipulate what firms do or simply because they are systematically different from the general run of the population, those data will cease to be as valuable. But of course, if that's your only knowledge of how much willingness to pay is out there, you won't be able to tell the difference between targeting people the wrong way and simply a lack of demand for what it is you're trying to sell. So this is not the kind of mistake that would necessarily correct itself. Now, privacy rights are a deeper kind of thing. They're fundamental human rights. There are many ways of expressing them. There's the economic way, the FIPP principles. There's the human rights approach that the OECD and the EU increasingly are taking. My bank account. There's nothing to interpret, or not much to interpret about that. Now, of course, if I think I've not signed a contract and you think I do, there is something there to litigate. But it's not nearly as subjective as infringement of privacy. And moreover, if we do things that infringe on people's privacy, like bumping into somebody on the street who's taken a few too many drinks on board, that may trigger other forms of action that are triggered by privacy, but not the use of the data that are involved in the privacy. It's just getting into people's public space. The difficulty is that if I've released information, it's hard to claw it back, and it's hard for me to know that it has been clawed back. This is one of the issues in the cloud. If I do a lot of storage in the cloud, I can demand the return of those data, but that's not a meaningful concept. Now, it may be that you can devise a mechanism whereby you simply and credibly destroy access to the public key, or the key, according to which those data are encrypted. So if the data are stored in encrypted form, you can get the key back somehow. That would be a reasonable way to do it. But in general, it's hard to reverse these things, hard to make restitution, in other words. It may also be the case that there are only certain times when you can release data in a meaningful way, and that later on, if you choose to correct those data, there may be an adverse consequence to doing it. So we can't treat sharing of data as a timeless kind of process. And finally, the private information, the information that's important to me, may not be matters of fact, where correcting errors of fact is a reasonable safeguard. When I mark examinations at the university, I tend to write things on the exam scripts. Some of these things are really quite frank. That is personal information of the student, to which the student now has a right of access, a right that is increasingly being exercised. But on the other hand, when I've marked the script, that script may also need to go for moderation. When it goes for moderation, it's important that the moderator should know the nature of my reaction, something more than the number that I wrote at the bottom of the script. So there's a problem there, and it's not simply an opposition of interests. If I failed, frankly, to express myself on the script, then the moderation process will not work effectively, the classification of examination results will not work effectively, all the students will suffer. If, on the other hand, I do express myself frankly, we'll get an FOIA request for the scripts, or Data Protection Act request, we'll release the scripts, and we will suffer, because we'll be dragged through the courts. Now, I don't know how to resolve this, but it's an increasing problem that's happening as more and more types of judgment come within the purview of private information, and credit ratings, and being turned down for credit ratings, or refused a visa, or something like that, come under that general heading. Our students can't question our academic judgment. They can only challenge procedural things, but the academic judgment is now part of their record. It's subjective to us, to a degree they'd be appalled to understand, but nonetheless, it's their personal data, and can't be released even if it's in their own interest.
Can you not phrase the comments in a way that raise no issues about following procedure and therefore have no legal consequence, but which still provide the information the moderation?
One could, if one wished to spend a lot of time in carefully wording those phrases, but then that amount of consideration in the way you do marking violates horizontal equity, right? If your script doesn't get me as angry as Chris's script does, then I'll be paying disproportionate attention to it. And if I've got 1 million scripts to mark in the exam boards tomorrow, it's just not feasible. Yeah, in principle, that would be right. And in principle, we should be being pushed in the direction of being more objective. But that may not allow us to mark to recognize the merit in scripts that don't conform to a nominal marking scheme as well.
But in effect, what privacy is doing, which I think is a value of it, is forcing you towards procedural fairness institutionally.
Yeah.
If it would take you too long to mark in that way, it's forcing your institution to pay more markers, ultimately.
Oh, no, actually, because it's not in our gift to pay more markers. What it's forcing us to do is to give...
charge the students more, ultimately, depending on what...
That's also not in our gift. What it allows us to do is to set simpler exams and give everyone 2 1s. And then watch what happens to the market value of a 2-1. Now, there is this thing about public figures, and another change that technology has wrought is that it's made us all into public figures. And we can't control what's known about ourselves. Even if we were the same person from moment to moment, situation to situation, it's very difficult to carefully choose what to reveal. I mean, when you talk to these people on the phone, I got called by people from the Mail on Sunday, and I reacted to my impression of the Mail on Sunday when they were asking me about the ONS figures on immigration and so on. I knew what they wanted to hear. I was determined that they shouldn't hear it from me, and I'm afraid I was incautious in my comments. Fortunately, they never went anywhere, but nonetheless. And so if we're not carefully choosing, then either we are carefully choosing, in which case you can't trust the data because they're manipulated to create an impression, or we're not carefully choosing, in which case mistakes can dog us for a very long period of time, which can chill our public engagement, or can cause us simply to become cynical and to emit random information, and whatever information was there in screening personal data may be lost.
But that's a classic justification for privacy, that it allows people, it's not just about secrecy, it's not just about keeping things to yourself, it's that it allows you to engage in social interactions while still having some control over the perception of you by other parties.
If you are allowed to, if you're in control of that privacy, right? If the privacy isn't something which says this information must be private, but is something which gives you control of who gets it and how, but there is still the problem of onward propagation, because the data that I give to you may find their way to Chris, or and so therefore, because you can't remove the record when its purpose is spent, or know that you've removed it, and because I certainly can't claw it back if during that period of time you said to Chris, hey, what about this? Does this make sense to you? I may be able to demand that you not make further use of it, but it's very difficult for me to demand that you tell Chris not to. So it is difficult because of that network nature of human society. Not just the public domain, but sort of many bits of private domain. Particularly when the links that led to that, the trusted links, may have been broken. Right? So you may be privy to confidences while you're part of a relationship. When the relationship is severed, the information about those confidences remains with you, and your willingness to use them in injurious ways may go up, not down. Okay. Now, there are other ways of protecting privacy. We've heard about ways that limit access or limit the inferences that can be drawn from access to that information. There's also the opposite one, which is simply to flood people with information that becomes too much for them to process, or to spoof them and try to trigger false positives, right, by mentioning Osama bin Laden in every third word every third sentence that you utter when you're sending messages through the American information space. But to a certain degree, we should step back. I would urge that we step back from privacy itself as a social construct to its functional characteristics. The fact that it lets us act for ourselves and not channel other people's actions, that it provides a period of respite, time out of the public view. When you're going around and always talking in public and so on, you're controlled by that environment, and you lose the time to reflect. So you wind up saying the things that you set out to say, even if you've changed your mind about them. You do need some period of time to relax, to remain an integral human being. And the psychologists have written quite a lot about that function of privacy. It provides, as Ian just said, a currency of goodwill or trust that you should be able to release information, not just for selfish reasons, but even for altruistic reasons. And it gives us a reason to be trustworthy. Now, identity is, well, we all know about the complexities of identity, that it multiplies, that we get many, many identities, and some of them we can control. So another of the fallacies that we may have around privacy is that privacy mechanisms can be designed and will function in the way in which they're designed. They're part of complex human organizations. In other words, each of us is a system. We're linked together. That makes a complex system. Complex systems have properties like emergence. So when I release information, I may anticipate that it's used in a particular way, but there are many times when I can't anticipate how it will be used. Not because a dictator will suddenly take over and look in the records and decide that I'm undesirable, but simply because my information will be compared with information about other people. Sensitivities will change as a result of events in the world that I can't control. And therefore, information that I didn't regard as sensitive and therefore as in my interest to release may turn to be not in my interest. And because it happens at system level and not at individual level, I can't anticipate or be held responsible for that in my judgments about other people. It really is a complex phenomenon. And therefore, governing macro behavior by putting rules on micro entities, well, we know that that doesn't work. It doesn't work for the banks, for example. Right? We found that we could control the banks by putting capital adequacy requirements on them, what's called microprudential regulation, so that they wouldn't fail, if it was possible for them not to fail. But if idiosyncratic risk that hits individual banks or individual people begins to become general, becomes systemic risk because it is packaged and moved onward through the system, and this could be whether or not I keep up my payments on a mortgage, things that might be considered private or not. They're still construed as adverse events, even if they are no longer my fault in any reasonable sense. And so that cannot be controlled by controlling individual entities. You need to actually look at the structure of the system and do what's some kind of macroprudential thing. So in that sense, privacy, or a concept of privacy, becomes a public good, a collective public good, and needs to be protected appropriately, I think, and not imposed on individuals. In the same way that things like creditworthiness, you can impose creditworthiness, and if I'm the only person and all the rest of you are being perfectly reasonable, and I'm the only person who's failing to pay his bills and so on, then it's quite reasonable to sanction me. But suppose that I'm one country in the Eurozone, right? Well, now it's not quite so obvious that we can point the finger at Greece or point the finger at Spain, or we'll run out of fingers pretty fast. I think we already have. And therefore, the incentives that are created by that kind of mechanism may rapidly switch from being positive incentives, where I want to get back on the right side, to being perverse incentives. And this is something else where theory can tell us quite a lot. You have these what are called coordination games. I don't have a picture of one. You can either, let's say, behave well or behave poorly. And if we are both behaving well, then that's good for us and it's good for the world. If we're both behaving poorly, if I switch to behaving well, that's not in my interest. It's bad for me. It may or may not. It's probably bad for you as well, because then I'll resent you and try to punish you and so on. So in a world like that, suppose you had people networked to each other, and the way the model works is randomly you pick a person, and you say to that person, consider what your neighbors are doing. Do you want to change your behavior? And so if most of my neighbors are behaving well, I will try to behave well. And if most of them are behaving poorly, I'll try to behave poorly. Now, we add to the model the fact that people are fallible. And so if I try to behave well, there's some small probability that I will behave poorly. So what we have then is a Markov process, an irreducible Markov process, whose states are, what is everyone in this world doing? Are they behaving responsibly or not? Now, because it's an irreducible Markov process, it converges to something almost surely, and we can ask what that something is. Now, in the case of a fully connected network of people, that something will be either everyone behaving well or everyone behaving poorly. Which one will it be? Well, you can't assert that it will be everyone behaving well. In fact, in that case where it's only two things that you can choose, it will be the thing that is best against a random opponent. More generally, the way it works is that if we are all behaving in a certain way and our expectations of privacy are self-reinforced, whether they are high privacy or low privacy, then there'll be a certain number of mistakes made by my neighbors, after which it will no longer be a mistake for people in my group to deviate to the other kind of behavior. It will be a rational response to what everyone around them is doing. So if you have one situation that takes more mistakes to upset it than another, that's the situation that will be stable. And the question as to which ones are stable lies partially with the payoffs, how do we treat people who depart from the social norm, but partially also in the connectivity of people. Who is connected to whom? If you have a hub and spoke system, then what the hub does, the spokes will eventually copy. If you have circles or other kinds of networks, you get different kinds of outcomes, which suggests that whether privacy works or not will depend on who people pay attention to and who they're worried about. And that, too, drives in the direction of macroprudential stuff. Okay, I won't say much more about identity. we can always come back to it and talk about it. One thing I will say, though, is that we do have means of identifying people strongly. Now, if my identity is based on a partial collection of records, the kind of thing that was the kind of data privacy that Joss was talking about before, it is possible for me to repudiate that by arguing that the records were wrong, for example, or to manipulate it by falsifying the records or getting somebody else to change their records. But there are other forms of identity, like, for example, an iris identification, where the identity is or is believed to be very strong. Now, the key is in that is believed to be. We used to think that fingerprints were a strong means of identity, and therefore that if you left your fingerprints at a crime scene, you had proven that you were at the crime scene. Now, like DNA evidence, it doesn't prove when you were there or what you intended to do or what you in fact did when you were there. But the fact that you had evidence that you were there would drive all of those other factors out of the mind of people investigating the crime, and then that would change the evidence that they collected, and it may well be that you were convicted. And that was exposed in the case of fingerprints by that Scottish policewoman whose dabs were found at the scene of a crime where she couldn't possibly have been. But nonetheless, independent fingerprint experts identified the ephemera as being hers. So if you have a strong form of identity, you're less likely to make mistakes, but the mistakes themselves may be more serious. And so in that sense, a certain amount of privacy, a certain buffer between you and the immediate consequences to you and the information sphere that surrounds you may be a useful thing because it prevents people from manipulating those systems. Okay, now I've talked about physical versus, wow, you don't even have to touch the screen. That's very nice. So then the final part of that trio of privacy and identity and trust is trust. And trust, in a certain sense, provides the structure of the way in which the society operates. And that's why I was very interested by this statement that you should trust systems or trust math and not trust people. Because when you think about statistical identification, identifying private people, there were classically two forms of error that the statisticians would draw attention to, type 1 and type 2 errors, false positives and false negatives, let's say. But there is a third, which is very pernicious, which is type 3 error, which is a precise solution to the wrong problem. And that wrong problem may be, for example, DNA evidence at the scene of a crime. Because, well, okay, it's probably a fairly obvious point. Now, the other thing about trust is that trust means, to a certain extent, not necessarily privacy per se, but the absence of information. If I'm in a contractual relationship with you, then trust means that I'm not monitoring everything that you do. If you give me more information, then I have some assurance as to whether you're doing it, but it's costly. I have to process and assess that information, or at least you have to take the trouble to send it to me. I may never read it. So in a certain sense, information and openness and transparency are at the opposite end from trust. And trust works because it's efficient, because not everybody has to have eyes on something which only concerns the action of one person. So to that extent, privacy, because it creates an unobserved space, enables certain forms of trust. If everything that I did, if my tax returns were online, then it becomes rather easier to determine whether the car that I'm driving is consistent with my declared income statements. And so it's that incompleteness of the contract that seems to be very important. Okay. Now, how am I doing? So that's about an hour. Okay. Now, there are a few technical elements I wanted also to introduce just because Joss had broken the ice with some equations. There are no equations in this, but these are things that I think are useful if we try to think about privacy, and in particular, notions like PITs and PETs, privacy invasive or privacy enhancing technologies. Because we're talking about technologies, but the thing that they are enhancing or invading is something which is not in itself technological. It may be economic, it may be societal or political, it's certainly highly subjective. So in order to jump that, it's nice to have some bits of apparatus. Now, game theory is sort of the common thing there, because it says that there are people who interact and they have reasoned decisions to make. And so, as in the example of the evolution of social conventions, it's very useful at predicting how social systems, how their behavior will organize itself. But perhaps the key element is what's called mechanism design. Normally when you do game theory, you say, here are the players, here are the strategies, here's the information, here are the payoff functions, here is a solution concept that summarizes their behavior. You can think of it as a prediction, particularly if it's a unique equilibrium or something like that. But it's really just a way of summarizing that information. And so that is a positive description of a situation. If the world is like this, then this will happen. But very often, the things that we want to see happening are things that we can't implement. You know, I want to sell you books that you want, but I don't know what books you want. You may not even know what books you want. And so the simple version is, you know I don't, so I get you to tell me. And that's the reference, you know, the recommendation system. And I draw inferences from the past. I try to refine my model of you. It's not a communication, it's a model. But it is a transfer of information to take us back to that basic situation. But suppose that you have an incentive to lie to me. Suppose, for example, that I book parking at Birmingham Airport. Well, I do this quite often. Now, when you book parking at Birmingham Airport, if you want to book for 2 days or more, you can either book in the close parking lot or the far away parking lot. Right? If you book in the close parking lot, it's very expensive. You book in the far away parking lot, it's much cheaper. But if you book in the far away parking lot, they will say to you on the last screen, do you want to upgrade to the close parking lot? And lo and behold, the price for doing that is lower than if you booked in the close parking lot. Right? So you have an incentive to release to them information about your preferences that is systematically biased, so they will pay you to release more information. Now, the same kind of thing happens with the flights that you book. I found that flying to Brussels from Birmingham, which used to be about 240 quid, is suddenly 600 pounds if you want to go for a day or 2 days. But if you want to go for 2 or 3 weeks, then it's back down to around 180, 220 pounds. Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that if you get a round trip like this and a round trip like this, you've reduced your ticket price by 2/3. Simply, but in order to do that, you have to control the inferences they've drawn on the profile information that you've given them. In other words, you need to have separate identities for the you that's flying from Brussels to Brussels via Birmingham and the you that's flying from Birmingham to Birmingham via Brussels. Because if they put the two together, they'll say, no, you have to use them sequentially. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Now what's going to, oh, well, at least I'll know who it was that noted. Yes, they can. I don't know this personally, but people have had that experience. And what happens is you go to book in for your flight, and it's been canceled because you made non-sequential use of 2 bookings. Anyway. In fact, just before the first EINS meeting in December, I had a long argument with them about something very similar. I won that one. But okay, so the point about mechanism design is, if there is an outcome you would like to see happen, but because of the hidden information that people possess or the hidden actions they can take, you can't design or control or compel them to do it. You rewrite the rules of the game in such a way that when they play the game, it will produce the right outcomes. And that's the way I tend to view privacy. That the way we define privacy rights creates a social mechanism. It changes people's behavior, whether they tell lies or tell the truth, whether there's any virtue in getting them to tell the truth, and whether the actions they take, knowing that they may be observed, are actions that we would like to see them take, that are efficient actions, or equitable actions, or actions that are self-interested and destructive. And it seems to me that if, for example, you create a reputation mechanism that has infinite memory and is non-forgiving, then in an equilibrium sense, it will be a perfectly good mechanism. Make one mistake and you're cast into the outer darkness forever. You will try to minimize the possibility of that first mistake. Now, that may not be a socially useful thing. It's very good at sorting people out into people who've made a mistake and people who haven't. It's not very good in encouraging people to recover from their mistakes. So it is an artifact of our social architecture as to which way we want to do that. But it does mean that these things are mechanisms. But they're not necessarily designed mechanisms. That's the final thing. I mean, the analysis says that you can look at certain social choice rules and ask whether they can be implemented and whether you can get people to reveal truthful information or not and what it will cost you to do it. But of course, this was pre-complexity. And now we know that you can try to design things and people will use it in other ways. Right? So that's what happened with Google Street View, for example. At first, it was just an add-on to increase the attractiveness of a platform and therefore increase the draw on third-party monetizers of the attention that was devoted to that platform. I mean, because Google wasn't selling this thing, but they were certainly selling the presence in people's minds that the availability of that thing created. Now, it had these other effects. And one of the other effects is, or might be, that that information thus gathered became valuable in other senses. And the example here is GStumbler, obviously, right? Originally, they were just beaking around for unprotected Wi-Fi networks to be able to geolocate the pictures that they had. But then once they got into those networks, they found that there was information to be had. And for some strange reason, they found it reasonable to collect that information and upload it to servers in the States. And then to say they weren't doing it, or maybe it was an accident, or they were doing it but they gave it back, or they got rid of it but there were some bits they weren't quite sure about, and could they get some advice? Anyway, it was a really interesting thing because they had hold of an asset of indeterminate value. If I've stolen the Mona Lisa, it's a valuable thing, but it's not of value to me because if I try to sell it, I'll get nailed. So there is a question, there's a little tap dance to find out whether this valuable asset is valuable to me or not, this informational asset. But it was created by creep from this mechanism that allowed people to go around and photograph what was in public view. Now, I used to live behind a castle in Kenilworth. And in the beginning, lots of people came to take pictures of the castle. It's the largest ruined castle in England and so on and so forth. And then after a few years, whenever they did that, people would come boiling out of the castle to tell them to go away, that they couldn't take a picture of it because they own the image rights to that castle. Yeah.
So I like to put different labels on the three of the bullets, like Adam Smith, Douglas North, and Levi-Strauss, and in other words, market, institution, and social relationship.
Yeah.
The thing is that they assume a radically different assumption about individual actors. So for example, sociologists assumes that individuals are so myopic in their social relationship, they see not beyond the first and second-hand relationships.
Yeah.
So privacy is all about within their close relationships. But in marketing institution, privacy in the public domain. So their motivation about their privacy can be so different.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's an excellent point because behavioral economics, for example, recognizes that extreme reductionism of the Chicago-style market interpretation is incorrect. On the other hand, the public domain is also not well defined. How big is the public? And what kinds of people does it contain? I live in a little village. Most of the people in the village are PLU, people like us. And at some crude level, the level to which they can observe me, I trust them with that information. Living in a big city, I would probably feel different. But Marcel Fafchon, who's an economist here, looked at people in Nepal, and one's in little villages and one's in Kathmandu, and found exactly the opposite. That in a large city, you can choose your friends much more easily, whereas in a village, if there's someone unpleasant living next door to you, they're your neighbor, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you would tend to trust them. So I think you're right that it's probably we need something more interdisciplinary. And the other thing, of course, is that markets are social institutions. And how you conduct yourself in a market, let's say, as a banker or an investment banker, is a moral and an ethical choice, and it's an act of social identity. So, yeah. Now, this is just kind of the old story, which is why it's nice to retreat into the technological element. And then the other part of the technical thing that's worth talking about is this notion of networks. And we all know about networks, but I just wanted to put this up here because there are some limitations in the way in which we often implement them. Generally, we look on networks, if there are n players, we look on networks as subsets of n squared. So they're links between pairs of people. But there are differences between a link between all three pairs of three people, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 1, and a link that involves 1, 2, and 3. And part of that is in this thing called common knowledge, that if, for example, I'm wearing a red hat or a green hat and it hasn't got a brim, and we've all got that, and the rule is that when you know what color your hat is, you have to leave the room. If there are at least 2 red hats in the room, or at least 2 red hats and at least 2 green hats in the room, then nobody knows anything, nobody does anything. And so somebody comes into the room and says, I can see a red hat in the room. So suppose the rule is, if you know your hat is red, you have to leave the room. That's the easy version. And they come in and say, I can see at least 1 red hat in the room. Well, they haven't said anything that everyone didn't already know. So nothing happens. Then they say it again, and nothing happens. And they say it a number of times equal to the number of red hats, and then everyone with a red hat gets up and leaves the room. So they haven't added any new knowledge, but they've added new knowledge about what other people knew. Because if I looked into the room and I saw 1 red hat, then I'd know there was either 1 red hat or 2. Right? If mine's red, there are 2. If mine's green, there's 1. So I'll wait to see if the other person reacts. If they don't react, they're waiting too, and it must mean me and them, because this is the only hat that they can see that I can't. And so it's that notion of the hierarchy, which comes back to this point about what I know that you know about my data. That's very important. And that's why a binary graph is inadequate often to describe social relationships that involve more than 2 people. Now, links in a graph can have strength, direction, duration. I can be observed but not know I'm observed. I can see you in a position to observe me, but you're not actually paying attention. So the act of observation is not symmetrical, and the act of having my data released is not symmetrical. It could be that I forget about these data. It could be that the data are only important under certain circumstances. I let you observe me doing something under circumstances where it doesn't matter. Then later circumstances arise where you can then look back to that and say, even at that point he showed that he was one of those. And that can be problematic. Now, the thing about networks is they're a topology. Right? When we talk about privacy, we're talking about things that are close or far away, close enough to pay attention to or far enough away to ignore. And a topology, that notion of closeness, in a network you have a particular version of that, which is the path length. How many hops does it take to get from A to B? And there's a problem here for things like privacy, which are down to closeness and whether I'm observed, in an electronic domain. Because in an electronic domain, we tend to pay attention to the shortest path. And most of the analysis we do is about the shortest distance between 2 points. But that only makes sense for electricity, which follows shortest paths. Anything else will follow long paths. And as we know from people like Granovetter, it may be the long paths, the weak connections, that are the most fertile and the most interesting. And that's one of the cultural differences. I don't care whether my neighbors hear me arguing with my son. My wife cares keenly, and the moment Ben and I begin to discuss politics, she closes all the windows, because that connection is very important to her. It's not a weak connection as far as she's concerned. But if I have an argument with Ben, and that leaves my next-door neighbor who ran for parliament to come over and intervene in this discussion, well, that's a useful thing that wouldn't have happened if the window had been closed. And then the other thing about networks is that they're layered. We're talking here about connections among people, but really, at some level, we're talking about connections among data about those people. If I put the records together, that creates a new record. And the thing is that that network of data is layered on top of the network of people, and things that draw things close together, a profile, for example, of a person, will change the relationships among the people. So relationships among data, relationships among people, they're linked to each other. And when we apply these networks, we need to be a little careful about them. And we have models of how these networks create themselves. Okay, there's some slightly more complicated stuff there. No, I won't. I have a little model that I sketched somewhere in the slides about notions of rights like economic rights and human rights as being a partition on outcomes in the world. And things are in the same element if from the standpoint of that construction of rights, they are equivalent. Right? So if two things are not to be distinguished in terms of whether you can bring a legal action or not, or whether you can contract or not, or whether you can make money or not, then a person who had one construction of rights or another would make different distinctions. When they interact with each other, they will reveal something about their belief about the world. It's in this set or it's in this set. Having heard what the other person says, they then revise their beliefs about the world and communicate further. And what happens is that everyone's construction of rights or ability to distinguish situations changes over time until it stops at a certain equilibrium. The equilibrium is determined in part by the power of the language that they have to communicate in. And so if we can only communicate in the language of lawsuits, we will stop at a different place than if we can trade our rights away or repackage or rebundle our rights. But the point that comes from that is that even though we may start in a world where the Europeans believe in human rights and the Americans believe in economic rights, we will eventually arrive at some synthesis between the two. And it's the richness of the language in which we communicate that will determine how the human right element and the property right element get put in together. But anyway, that's a technical model and needs more explanation than I can give.
It sounds like Habermas.
Sorry?
It sounds like Habermas.
Yeah, there's something Habermasian about it. Okay, so that's the point about that. We could argue about safe harbor. I should stop and let us talk about that rather than carrying on. Okay, that's the model. The slides will be available in case you want to see it and then talk about it. And I wanted to hop on to another point, which is that these rights are collective property rights and that there are informational commons. No, actually, that's probably not worthwhile. Sorry, having heard the other talks, I'm trying to conclude with some bits that haven't been said. So, in relation to personal information or privacy being of economic value, it's also reasonable to consider the ecosystem of business models that underlie the use of that value. And so some of the ways in which that manifests itself are people who have a model which is designed to harvest and resell behavioral data that reveals preferences. So this is offering people choices as a way of getting them to reveal some underlying preference about themselves that you can then resell to third parties. And many of the free offers that we have for social network platforms and so on exist with that kind of model. There are others that use stored profile information. This is real data that wasn't evoked by the interaction. It was data that was there and was stored. And that can be mined and then mashed together to create new derivative assets of potential value. There's the thing about nudging people, behavioral manipulation, if you like, which is, I regard as a privacy infringement, but certainly not from the perspective of the Data Protection Directive. There are also the markets that exist on top of those underlying problems, that if you know there is a risk, you'll pay to be protected from that risk. And Joss's example of the people who pay to have their privacy protected in their smart meter setups and their smart grid setups is an example of that. Right? There's no obvious reason why they should pay for protection. It sounds like a protection racket, really. We threaten you, and you can pay us not to exercise the threat. It doesn't really sound like a classic economic transaction, but who am I to say? We may decide that they're our friends because the result of that will be a policy discourse or a social discussion, which will lead us to a better understanding of what's ethical and what isn't. We'll have privacy intermediaries, people who will either act on our behalf and whose information is therefore stands between us and the monitors, or people who will help to control the public face of our information. And there are certainly people who will do that, or who will take our information and use our profiles, like quintessentially.com or quintessential.com, I forgot which one it is, who will actually, find out when you're going to another city what hotel you should stay in, what restaurants you should eat in, but in a way that is definitely not like TripAdvisor. I mean, they really know who you are and you tell them in great detail. And then once we have the private information being valuable, we can recombine that information and we can create derivative assets on top of it. Right? So an asset is something that is a network. It connects money at different dates, states of the world, and points in space. It's a bundle of those things. And a derivative asset is linking up other dates and states. And therefore it creates this new population, a richer population, whose function is to span the needs of people, in this case for patterns of return. The same thing is true for access to data. It may be important for me that you know about whether I like salty foods or not, or spicy foods or not. It may not be important that you know other things, and there may be other things I don't want you to know about. If all we have is your being able to observe my behavior directly, there's no way to control that and get an efficient packaging of a transfer of information. So even the current system of economic property rights as it exists in the US context doesn't allow for the tailoring of those property rights to reconcile the needs of the data subjects and the abilities or capabilities of the people who will offer things to those data subjects. And then, of course, pits and pets are things that people can sell, and they do sell. And those two are markets that are created on top of this. And then I'll just... Another thing about privacy protection regimes is that they have these two properties. That if we have cash assets, for example, cash transactions are very privacy friendly in one sense, because cash has no memory. It doesn't know who it came from, and you can't trace transactions. Now that denies you certain assurances. If you go back to the place where you bought this thing for cash and say, hey, it doesn't work, they say, have I seen you before? I don't think so. On the other hand, it means that if other people want to trace your transactions, they can't do it because there isn't a record of it. And so if we have two kinds of mechanisms, one that is very privacy friendly and one that isn't, a walled garden or a Wild West kind of atmosphere, then people won't randomly sort themselves out. And their sorting out may be correlated with things that we care about. It may be that people, for example, who have no moral character will opt for regimes that have very strong formal protections, either to control themselves or to assure other people that they're okay. Whereas people who have internalized all these values about what is the correct way to treat a confidence may opt for regimes that are very cheap because they don't have any of those formal protections. That was the way the City of London used to operate many, many, many years ago. Or it could go the other way, of course. And then there are incentive effects. That once you become aware of the value of your information, it will change the way you behave. I started lying on web forms. Anything that didn't have an asterisk gets a random answer, or no answer at all. And there's no particular reason for that. It's just a general feeling that you don't need to know it, so unless you can tell me why you want to know it and why it's in my interest, you're not going to know it. But that's not in the mechanism. That's in the attitude that's behind the mechanism. That's the social construct. Now, the other thing is that when we do that, when we devise these privacy mechanisms, we are reallocating risk and responsibility. Right? If I have a privacy domain which says that the onus is on data processors or data controllers to respect certain rights of people, I've decided that the responsibility belongs there rather than on the people themselves to control the dissemination of their property. Now, it's not obvious that that's an efficient allocation of risk and responsibility. What we have is a default allocation. And the fact that there are problems with that default allocation might suggest that we either need a different default allocation or we need a toolbox where people can choose things that are more appropriate. Okay.
We've only got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, that's why I'm skipping right ahead. No, I've sort of talked about all of those. Yeah, those are just examples of biometrics and privacy in public contexts that you can look at if you like. But we all pretty much know what those things are. And, okay. So just to conclude then, in respect of the increasing value of privacy, or personal data as the new oil. If we limit our attention to privacy, we have to know that these different players of governments and businesses and civil society and all the other varieties that we can divide ourselves into have strong stakes in the outcome, but they start from different places and they haven't articulated always their assumptions. Businesses, for example, would think that they are customer-centric, but they haven't necessarily articulated or kept pace with changes, in which that means they are customer-centric because they are orientated towards filling my needs, or customer-centric in the sense that they ask me what my needs are before they fill them, right? They're different senses. You know, a pig cooked on a plate is central to the meal, but probably wouldn't feel very happy about being there. So if we're going to think about a rebalancing of risks and responsibilities, we should probably think about the differences in these stakes. Another thing is that we have these beliefs of aggregation and power, and the internet does rather change those. We used to think, for example, that individual actions had localized consequence, and group actions, large group actions, had large consequences, and that these consequences could be understood and responsibility fixed accordingly. But what seems to happen in the internet, certainly what happens in financial markets, is that very small changes at the right or the wrong time can have enormous consequences, which means that individuals making publicly observed changes, the ones that are likely to trigger those reactions, are faced with the knowledge that they have a lot of power in their hands, but they're absolutely incapable of understanding what it will mean if they choose this or choose this. And that's a problem, because then the nature of their rational decision making, their informed ability to give informed consent and to respond accordingly will change. And so the fact that these outliers exert disproportionate influence, that individuals can exert disproportionate influence, and that the networks of influence and attention organize themselves in such a way that they bring themselves to the brink of disruptive or catastrophic change, means that crises will become more frequent rather than less frequent. So incidents of data loss, for example, and data release, are not reacted to as statistical occurrences, nor should they be, because when we read about these things, everybody changes their behavior. And so the underlying distribution of the likelihood of a data release changes. Now, ideally, it should change in ways that make bad things less likely and good things more likely, but we're talking about a complex system of people's interactions. What we know is that there's an endogeneity problem, a big endogeneity problem, that information about privacy breaches changes privacy behavior. But that's all we can actually say. And that, I think, is a very large research challenge. And because we can't assign responsibility to the data subjects or the data processors, and because in some contexts like the cloud, even the distinction between data processor and data controller is a meaningless distinction, because at different points in your operation you will be both, it seems that we need to do something to open things up, at least, to reconsider whether we're at the right place. And then two final things are that it seems to me that if we are successful in collecting all these data, it will be overwhelmingly tempting to use very efficient computational algorithms to analyze those data. But the algorithms we tend to use take a very unsophisticated view of the data. They view the data as coming from exogenous, independent, knowable distributions. They don't do endogeneity, they don't do dynamics, they don't do interactivity very well. And we see this with computer-based financial trading. All those high-speed algorithms are implementing the most simple possible rules of thumb. Now, this is nice in one way. It's nice in the sense that their behavior is now predictable. Even though it's large-scale, very fast, huge volumes of trade, we know what the underlying thinking behind it is. What we don't know is what happens when it bumps up against the thinking of another process. March of 2010, a program in New York dumped a ton of trades on the New York Stock Exchange. Those trades slowed down the propagation of information through the network. And all the other programs throughout the US that were trading on the basis of quote information went on chasing price differentials that were no longer there, not knowing they were trading on stale data. The result was, in 2 minutes, $16 trillion was wiped off the value of the exchanges. well, I say wiped off the value of the exchanges. That means evaluating all the shares of stock outstanding at the current price was now 16 trillion less. 28 minutes later, it was all back again, but not in the same pockets where it had been before. So there was a huge perturbation caused by a very tiny event, and the rest of it was just the operation of the system. In that sense, when you collect lots of data, if you analyze them in a very simple way, you still haven't got rid of the problem. When we were far from efficient markets and far from a situation in which we could guarantee our privacy, we behaved as though that were a common aspiration. And we had rough consensus and running code, as it were. We had a reasonable approximation to our behavior, and we understood it. As we get closer and closer to the theoretical ideal of being able to trace the information and process it and so on and so forth, it seems to depart more and more from the theoretical ideal. This is, I think, a problem. And then finally, we can have this success through failure. These complex systems do self-organize. If you don't resist that and just don't try to micromanage it and understand everything that's going on, but set up crash barriers and look for leading indicators of disruptive change. And in this particular case, I mean a sharp bifurcation between people who become entirely careless of their personal information and people who become paranoid and obsessive and opt out with their personal information, knowing that those who become careless and those who become careful may not be the ones in whose interest it is to become careless or careful. But if we step back from that a little bit and say, what is it we really care about? Can we patch up the mistakes and learn from them? Or can we allow things to change at a macroprudential level? Then maybe we'll survive. Okay, that's a lot, and it's gotten very hot. So.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any questions for Jonathan or comments they want to make in response? Yeah, Casper?
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Casper.
Sorry, I had a note of my question here, just 2 seconds. Couple of questions. One is privacy derivative assets. It's a very interesting idea. Have you seen any literature, substantial literature yet, on what those might look like mathematically?
Yes, in the sense of privacy identifiability of financial transactions. There's quite a large literature in the foreign exchange literature about identifiability of transactions and what the differences are between single rules, which apply uniformly, and optional rules, and how one could then devise trades, contingent trades, in which, under certain circumstances, identities would be revealed.
Is this to try and establish, say, counterparty risk by knowing the flows associated with particular banks, for example? So
yeah, it's trying to round off the counterparty risk,
right,
so you know where the risk is living and under what circumstances it will come back. But,
thank you. I'll look at that. But anything on, as it were, individual privacy or personal?
No, as far as I know, that's just something which just seemed like a sensible idea.
So the larger question, I guess, is about privacy as the new oil, the
Yeah,
buzzphrase.
yeah, the OECD thing.
And just to take a step back from the economic analysis, it seems to me that the situation we're always in the economics of privacy is that there's this extreme asymmetry of information between the level of analysis, the level of strategies that an individual consumer might feasibly be able to apply against what the organization wishing to use that information is going to do, because one has no idea really, given the state of regulation, of the detailed purposes. One doesn't have a legal right in most cases to the algorithms, because that would be commercially sensitive.
Yeah.
And so there's this immense collective action problem before one can even get off the ground floor of applying economic tools to assert, for example, any efficiency in the market, or even apply traditional information economics. So how do you think we should deal with this extreme collective action problem? Because if one says, well, privacy intermediaries, bargaining on behalf of the individual, there's a circularity there, because you come back to the problem of trust and what that intermediary may be going to do with you, and why should I trust that intermediary?
Yes, because even if the intermediary starts out as a purely cooperative venture, it will in fact, well, I mean, look at all the Googles and the Yahoos and the Facebooks, right? Just a bunch of hippies sitting around trying to do something that was okay, and now they're all corporate droids trying to rip everybody off. That's an exaggeration. But I think that in the same way, regarding the other end of the collective action problem as being a monolithic corporate structure or oligopoly that's based on an opposition of interest is possibly wrong. And so therefore, you know, I think there are mutual gains to be had, and I think the mutual gains outweigh the attempts to capture informational surplus from people by capturing their private information, in the sense that if competition works, if I can release my private information to many people, then I can set up a form of informal bidding war. That doesn't
surely the example you offered about the airport car park, I mean,
Yeah.
that's an excellent example of what, from the individual point of view, looks like predatory pricing. What, from an economist's point of view, they would call avoiding deadweight loss.
Well, efficient price discrimination or differentiation, yeah. That's what Chris and I would call it in the context of net neutrality, I'm sure, right? That without that form of differentiation, the market might not even exist. I mean, I don't know what it costs to run an airport parking system. That's probably a bad example. But there are certain fixed costs to defray. And if those fixed costs are large enough, unless you treat people inequitably, it won't happen. So Ramsey pricing would say that you need to have these subsidies. And therefore, if people have the choice, they will not pay the subsidy and will be stuck without whatever it is we need. So there is a kind of equity efficiency trade-off.
I suppose if one transfers from the physical world to information goods,
Yeah.
then often it may be advantageous to deal anonymously, if one can, for
Yep.
the reasons that you say. And so in information goods, one may not be talking about the non-existence of a market that would not exist in the physical world. One may be talking about actually locking in some kind of oligopoly in a market which could otherwise shift to a different place.
And in fact, in that sense, it's not just anonymously. You could imagine a total anonymity in which each of my transactions was divorced from every other one, right? That wouldn't necessarily be in my interest. But releasing a profile of transactions that couldn't be traced back to me as an individual would allow the marketer to combine it with other profiles to see whether there are patterns there that could be beneficially adjusted. And because they couldn't address me directly, they would have to attract me. And that's bound to be in my interest. So that kind of intermediary form of anonymity, where I release distributional information or the affiliation of the random variables, would probably be in my interest. But I think there is this other part of the issue, which is that the thing about it being the new oil, leaving aside the question about whether it's an exhaustible asset or not, is that it does rather assume that once it becomes an asset, the people who own it will recognize its value. So if it becomes not just like a symptom that the doctor can observe, but something in which I can invest, right? So if I whip up a cough before I go to the doctor because I want a sick note to be out of an examination, let's say, actually, yes, as senior tutor, I see a ton of these things, right? All these sick notes, which I know were designed, right? It's private information interpreted for me, and I know that that interpretation was the purpose behind the creation of the information. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting problem. I would avoid thinking about atomistic individuals and collusive firms as being opposite ends of the spectrum. I think they probably interpenetrate, and I think that ratings agencies, for example, and perhaps blogs and so on, perform that sort of semi-aggregation function. But I'm not quite sure how this works. But I know there have been issues about the release of personal information and the reliability of personal information in those spaces.